Extinguishment of Obligations, Part 3. We are now going to talk the fifth and sixth modes of extinguishment of obligations by compensation and by novation, respectively. Compensation. According to Article 1278, compensation takes place when two persons in their own right are creditors and debtors of each other. Meaning, when we speak of compensation, it is the extinguishment to the concurrent amount of debts of two persons who, in their own rights, are debtors and creditors of each other. It involves the simultaneous balancing of two obligations in order to extinguish them to the extent in which the amount of one is covered by that of the other. For example, A owes B the amount of 1,000 and B owes A the amount of 1,000. So, kung may utang si A kay B na 1,000 at si B may utang kay A na 1,000, anong tawag doon? Quits na, di ba? In the street slang, okay? Sa slang or dun sa usapang kalye, quits na tayo. May utang ako sa'yo, may utang ka sa akin, quits na tayo. So, yun ang ibig sabihin ng compensation. Okay, paano nyo ba siya madidistinguish with confusion? When we speak of confusion, iisa lang. There is only one person who is a creditor and debtor of himself. Diba? Nag-merge ang pagiging debtor at saka creditor ng tao sa iisang tao. On the other hand, pag sinabi mong compensation, dalawang tao ito na parehong merong utang sa isa't isa. And in confusion, there is only one obligation. Isa lang obligation dito, nagbayad hanggang sa nakabalik sa'yo. Isa lang yung nagpasalin-salin at nagpapasa-pasa ng obligasyon. On the other hand, when we speak of compensation, dalawang obligation dito. Yung isa, obligation na may utang dun sa isa, at yung isa, may utang naman dun sa pabalik, dun sa kabila. So, there are two distinct obligations. In confusion, there is impossibility of payment. Why? Ano bang babayaran? Bumalik na rin naman sa iyo yung utang. There is no need to payment. There is already impossibility. On the other hand, when we speak of compensation, there is indirect payment. Hindi nga lang nagbayad directly, pero there is indirect. Parang nagbayad. Okay? Parang nagbayad. Now, question. Meron bang compensation sa joint and solidary obligation? Yeah, the answer to that question is pwede. There may be compensation in joint and solidary obligation. That's according to Article 1207, 1208, 1215 of the new Civil Code. What are the different kinds of compensation? By its effect, pwedeng total or partial. Pag sinabi nating total, when both obligation are of the same amount and are entirely extinguished. Article 1281 of the new Civil Code. Dito, sinasabi merong total extinguishment kasi pareho yung amount. Gaya ng binigay kong example na si A may utang kay B ng 1,000 at si B may utang kay A ng 1,000. So that is total. But when we speak of partial, ito yung when two obligations are of different amounts and a balance remains. The extinctive effect of compensation will be partial only as regards the larger debt. Si A may utang kay B na 1,000, si B may utang kay A na 700. So, anong mangyayari? Pwedeng i-compensate up to 700 lang. So, may matitirang 300. So, na-extinguish yung 700 pesos lang. Partial lang ang compensation. Now, ano pa ang different kinds of compensation? Pwede ring legal, voluntary, judicial. Because of the cause or origin. Pag sinabi mong legal compensation, it takes place by operation of law, even without the knowledge of the parties. Walang consent, walang knowledge ang parties dito, pwedeng by operation of law. Voluntary, when it takes place by agreement of the parties. Yung mismong parties ang nag-agree. Judicial, when it takes place from the order in a litigation. Okay? Sa litigation naman to, korte naman ang nagsabi na, oy, pwede na kayong mag-compensation, pwede na nyong gamitin ang mode of compensation to extinguish your obligation. Meron pa tinatawag, the facultative, which is Article 1287, Paragraph 1 of the New Civil Code hanggang 1288. Ito yung tinatawag nating facultative compensation because it can be set up only by one of the parties. Okay? Now, when we speak of legal compensation, meron dapat yang requisites. Okay? So, what are the requisites? Number 1, that the parties are principal debtors and principal debtors of each other. That the parties are principal creditors and principal debtors of each other. Okay? Example, A owes B and B owes A. So both are principal creditors and principal debtors. Okay? So number 2, what else? What else? Both debts consist in a sum of money or of consumable things of the same kind and quality. Okay? Both debts consist in a sum of money or of consumable things of the same kind and quality. Example, A owes B 1,000. B owes A an electric range worth 1,000. So halos pareho lang. Consumable things of the same kind and quality. So pag binenta 1,000, so pwedeng makompensate. Okay? Pwedeng mag-quits. Number 3, the debts are due and demandable. Okay? A owes B 1,000 pesos due today. B owes A 1,000 pesos due yesterday. Diba? Ngayon nagkasingilan. Due and demandable na pareho. Pero kung next month pa yung isa, hindi pa pwedeng pumasok ang compensation. Okay? As a general rule, hindi pwedeng pumasok ang compensation. However, kung umabot ito ng next month, umabot do sa taning ng isa, they both become due and demandable, then the mode of extinguishment with regard to compensation will take effect. Number 4, the two debts are liquidated. Okay? When you say two debts are liquidated, example, A owes B 1,000, B owes A the share of the latter in the business, the amount of which is still to be ascertained. Ibig sabihin, in a way, may value. Hindi pa pwedeng walang value. Kasi gaya nun, sa stocks, ang usapan 1,000 ng utang. Paano kung ibabayad mo sa akin shares of stocks? Hindi pa siya na-ascertain kung magkano. Pero once ascertained na 1,000 ng value, pwede na. Pero kailangan, the moment that compensation takes place, the amount should be liquidated. Okay? Now, number 5, meron tayong tinatawag na negative requisite for legal compensation, and that is no retention or controversy commenced by a third person. Hindi pa pwede because there are two debts and two obligations. Hindi pa pwedeng merong controversy ang either obligation. Dapat yan, in the same manner, it should be freely disposed. Dapat freely madedispose yan. At it should be the capacity to alienate. Importante pa rin yun. Hindi pa pwedeng basta-basta na lang nagko-compensate. Yun pala, merong controversy yung pera. So those are the 5 legal or requisites of legal compensation. Okay? So now, yung question, yung compensation ba will benefit the guarantor? Will compensation benefit the guarantor? Compensation will benefit the guarantor, although the guarantor is only subsidiarily not principally bound. He is given the right to set up compensation. The reason is that extinguishment of the principal obligation as a consequence of compensation carries with it accessory obligation such as guarantee. Diba? Pag merong guarantor ang isang utang, kung nagkaroon ng compensation, nag-quits, ano mangyari sa guarantor? O, edi syempre mag-benefit din siya. Bawi na. Okay? Bawi na sila. Now, when we speak of total and partial compensation, lahat yan ay nag-a-apply sa mga different kinds of compensation. Okay? Voluntary or conventional includes any compensation which takes place by agreement of the parties. Naulit ko lang lahat Judicial compensation, ito yung dinedeclare ng court by final judgment. Okay? Question. Is compensation allowed in rescissible or voidable contracts? Of course, when we speak of rescissible, that is Article 1381, and voidable contracts, Article 1390, you will learn all this. Pag ito yung mga contracts na defective contracts, ika nga. You will learn about this pagdating natin sa contract. Ang tinatanong lang naman dito, kung pwede ba i-compensate ang rescissible or voidable contract. The answer is yes, because not unless the contract is void ab initio or void na siya umpisa pa lang, or impossible, or not valid, then the compensation is allowed in rescissible and voidable contracts. Okay? Else, where compensation has taken place before or after assignment. Okay? Dito medyo you have to listen. Kasi, ibig sabihin, there are 3 parties here. A, B, and C, kunyari. Si A may utang kay B, si B may utang kay A, pero si B, inassign niya yung utang niya kay C. Okay? Okay, ulitin ko ha. Lagyan na natin ng presyo. Si A may utang kay B na 3,000 due yesterday. Si B may utang kay A na 3,000 due din yesterday. However, si B, inassign niya yung right niya kay C. So, si C ang pwedeng mangolekta kay A. Okay? Kasi inassign niya. Okay, now, the question is, kung before or after, what will happen? Okay? If before the assignment, meron ng compensation, then, it extinguishes the debt because it was already assigned before compensation has taken place. Meaning, hindi mo na pwedeng i-assign. Kasi ba't pa i-assign? Tapos na. Na-i-compensate mo na. So, in effect, the right of the compensation may be waived by the debtor before the assignment. Okay? If A gave his consent to the assignment before it was made or subsequently, A loses the right to set up the defense of communication. Okay? Siyempre, kasi tapos na nag-compensation na So, paano pa yon? Hindi na uubra dahil nag-compensation na. So, that is before the assignment. Okay? Ngayon, kung after the assignment, okay, yung compensation in-assign after the assignment, is it valid? Yes. That is very, very valid because una, titignan muna natin, may knowledge pa pala muna yung consent or wala. Yung assignment ba may consent o wala? Kasi pwede rin yun. Okay? So, bigyan natin ng example para mas maintindihan nyo. Assignment with the consent of debtor, si A owes B 3,000 June, November 15. Si B owes A 3,000 June, November 15. Ginawa ni B, inassign niya yung karapatan niya kay C on November 1 with the consent of A. On November 15, A cannot set up against C, the assignee, the compensation which would pertain to him against B. The assigner, in other words, A is liable to C for 3,000, but he can still collect the 1,000 debt of B. Kuha nyo? However, if A, while consenting to the assignment, reserve his right to the compensation, then he would still be liable. Okay? So, what else? Number 2, assignment with the knowledge but without the consent of debtor. Kanina may consent, ngayon wala na. A owes B 1,000. B owes A 1,000. Yung kay A owes B ng 1,000 sa November 1 ang bayad noon. Si B owes A 1,000, due naman ito November 10. Ginawa ni A, assign his right to C on November 12. A notified B that the latter did not give his consent to the assignment. How much can C collect from B? First, B can set up the compensation of debts on November 10, which was before the session. On November 12, paragraph 2, there being partial compensation, the assignment is valid only up to the amount of 1K. Okay? Okay, what else? Compensation where debts are payable at different places. Kung halimbawa, yung pagkakautang ay iba't ibang lugar. Okay? What will happen? Of course, the indemnity contemplated in the law is that not refer to the difference in the value of things in their respective places, but to the expenses of monetary exchange. In case of money debts and expenses of transportation, once these expenses are liquidated, the debts also become compensable. The indemnity shall be paid by the person who raised the defense of compensation. Foreign exchange has been defined as the conversion of an amount of money or currency of one country into an equivalent amount of money or currency of another. Okay? A owes B $1,000 payable in New York. Okay? A owes B $1,000 payable in New York. B owes A possibly 26,000 payable in Manila. If A claims compensation, he must pay for the expenses of the exchange. Okay, yun ang sinasabi lang doon ng ating payable at different places. Okay? Instances when legal compensation is not allowed by law. Meron ba na hindi pinapayagan ang legal compensation? Meron. Unang-una, where one of the debts arises from a depositum. Okay? Kung isa doon sa mga utang, di ba? Remember, dalawang utang? Kung isa doon ay depositum. Ano ba ibig sabihin ng depositum? A deposit is constituted from the moment a person receives thing belonging to another with the obligation of safely keeping it and returning it. Okay? Hindi pa pwede kasi yung isa utang, yung isa depositum. Hindi pa pwede yun. Ang depositum, wala ka naman pag-aari doon. Your right is only limited to your right is only limited to holding the thing in deposit. Okay? Next. Where one of the debts arises from comodatum. When we speak of comodatum naman, ito naman yung gratuitous contract whereby one of the parties delivers to another something not consumable that the latter may use the same for a certain time and return it. Ito yung mga pahiram. Comodatum. Okay? So, hindi rin pa pwede yun. Number 3, where one of the debts arises from a claim for support due by gratuitous title. Because support comprises everything that is indispensable for sustenance, dwelling, clothing, medical advance, education, and transportation in keeping with the financial capacity. Okay? Ano pa? Rules on application of payments apply to order of compensation. Because compensation is similar to payment. If a debtor has various debts which are susceptible of compensation, he must inform the creditor which of them shall be the object of compensation. In case he fails, the compensation shall take place to the most onerous obligation. Tandaan niyo, pag nagbabayad, parating dun sa pinakamabigat na babayarin. Same. Hindi pa pwedeng yung pinakamagaan. Usually pinakamabigat. Because the law favors the weak. Yan. Sino ba mga nangungutang? Eh, di ba yung mga walang pera, yung mga mahihina? So, sila usually nangungutang. Kailangan ba ang consent ng parties pag sa legal compensation? Compensation takes place automatically by mere operation of law. So, full legal capacities of the parties are not required because it is the law. And without any act of the parties, it is not required that the parties have full legal capacity. Okay? So that is compensation. We move to the last mode of extinguishment, novation. According to 1291, obligations may be modified by, number 1, changing their object or principal conditions. Number 2, substituting the person of the debtor. Number 3, subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. Tatlo yun. Sa novation, changing their object or principal conditions, substituting the person of the debtor, or subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. Anong ibig sabihin ng novation? Novation is the total or partial extinction of an obligation through the creation of a new one with substitutes. it. It is the substitution or change of an obligation by another, which extinguishes or modifies the first either by changing its object or principal condition, or by substituting another place of another debtor, or by subrogating third person in the rights of the creditor. So yan ang ibig sabihin ng novation. Merong dual function ng novation. There is. Novation is a contract containing two stipulations. One to extinguish or modify an existing obligation, and the other to substitute a new one in place. Okay? It does not operate an absolute but only a relative extinction, because it creates a new one in the place of which is only modified. Okay? Dual function yan. Yung isa, dalawa ang stipulation, magkaibang-iba. So, pag pinagpalit mo or pinalitan mo, wala na, in-extinguish yung obligation through substitute a new one in its place. Okay? Kinds of novation. According to origin, legal, conventional. Ano yung legal? It takes place by operations of law. Number 2, it takes place by the agreement of parties. That's 1 and 2. Next, according to how it is constituted, express, implied. Expressed means when it's so declared in an equivocal terms. Implied when the old and the new obligations are necessarily incompatible with each other. Dapat incompatible sila bago masabing there is an implied novation. According to the extent, total or partial. Total or extinctive when the old obligation is completely extinguished. Pag yung old obligation na-extinguish na. Okay, yung bagong obligation, ibang usapan yun. Dapat complete. Partial or modifactory when the old obligation is merely modified. The change is merely incidental to the main obligation. Okay? According to subject, real or objective when the object or principal conditions of the obligation are changed. Okay? Kahit anong pagbabago, kahit anong change ang gagamitin, siyempre, there is a real and objective change. Personal, when the person of the debtor is substituted or when third person is subrogated in the rights of the creditor. Mixed, when the object and or principal conditions of the obligation, the debtor or the creditor or both parties are changed. It is a combination of real and personal. Okay, tatlo yun according to subject. Real, personal, and mixed. Bigyan ko ng example ng personal. If after the constitution of the obligation, both parties, C will substitute S for that D will be subrogated in the rights of B, there is a principal novation in this case. C becomes the new debtor or D, the new creditor, as the case may be. What are the requisites of novation? Of course, there is a previous valid obligation. Dapat meron yun. Capacity and intention of the parties to modify or extinguish obligation. Number 3, the modification or extinguishment of obligation. The creation of a new obligation. 4 lang yun. Requisites of novation. Okay? Next. Tandaan nyo, class, ang novation is never presumed. Never. It must be clearly and unmistakably established either by express agreement of the parties or acts of equivalent import. Okay? Remember that it is never presumed. Ano pa? Or by the incompatibility of the two obligations which with each other in a very material aspect. Dapat, sinasabi lang dito, dapat may pakita na yung dalawang contract ay ibang-iba bago mag-take place ang novation. Okay? Because hindi pine-presume ang novation. Because again, ito ay burdensome. Okay? Burdensome. Pabigat. Basta pabigat, burdensome. Now, paano ba malalaman natin kung incompatible ba ang dalawang contract? Diba? Paano natin matitest ang incompatibility? Okay? We will look at it as before between two contracts. Ano ba yung mga gagawin natin to test their incompatibility? The test is whether they can stand together, each one having an independent existence. If they cannot, they are incompatible, and the subsequent obligation novates the first. Upon such novation, the former obligation loses all its force and effect, and the only one can be enforced. Example, S agreed to deliver B a car on November 10. Subsequently, a second agreement was entered into whereby S will deliver a truck on November 10. Is there novation? Yes. There's no novation because it is not so declared expressly by parties in their good agreement, and the two obligations are not incompatible with each other and which can stand separately. Okay? Yun yung sinasabi natin. Pwede ba? S agreed to deliver to B a car on November 10. Subsequently, a second agreement was entered into by S will deliver a truck on November 10. Is there a novation? The answer is kung ibang-iba. The answer is yes. Pero kung pareho, walang novation. Pero in my example, there is no novation because it is not so declared expressly by the parties. Next, what are the different kinds? What are the different kinds of personal novation? Personal novation may be in the form of substitution and subrogation. Ibig sabihin ng substitution at subrogation. When the person of the debtors is substituted, diba? Pag yung person of the debtor is substituted, that is substitution. Ako yung nagpapautang si debtor, gusto magpalit, that is substitution. Number 2 is subrogation. When a third person is subrogated in all the rights of a creditor. Kung ako si creditor at meron akong kapatid, may mangyari sa akin, si third person ang maghahabol sa'yo. Okay? That is Civil Code. Article 300 of the Civil Code. What are the different kinds of substitution? The different kinds of substitution naman is that it's either expromission or delegation. Ano sabihin ng expromission? Expromission means It takes place when a third person of his own initiative, without the knowledge or against the will of the original debtor, it assumes the creditor's obligation and with the consent of the creditor. Okay? So, nagpalit ng debtor, pero may consent si original creditor. That is expromission. It is essential that the old debtor be released from obligation, otherwise there is no promission or expromission. Pag sinabi mong delegasyon, or that which takes place when the creditor accept a third party to take place of the debtor at the approval of the debtor, the creditor may hold the creditor may withhold approval, because in delegation all the parties, the old debtor and the new debtor and the creditor must agree. Okay? Rights of the new debtor, sino ba nagbabayad? Siyempre, in expromission, payment by the new debtor gives him the right to beneficial reimbursement. Expromission. Payment by the debtor gives him the right to beneficial payment. If the payment was made with the consent of the original debtor or on its own, the debtor is entitled to reimbursement and subrogation. Suppose in the same example, suppose in the example given, the debtor tells C creditor that T will pay this debt. C agrees. It does not necessarily mean that there is delegation. But if D tells C that T will pay his debt, then he asks T to release him from his obligation, to which C agrees, delegation results. Okay? Ito yung example na yun. Effect of new debtors' insolvency or non-fulfillment of the obligation in expromission and delegation. What is the effect? In expromission, the new debtor's insolvency or non-fulfillment of the obligation will not revive the action of the creditor. Will not against the holder whose obligation is extinguished by the assumption of the debt by the new creditor. Thus, in the second example, if there is expromission, D will no longer be liable in case of insolvency of T or non-fulfillment of T by his obligation. Okay. Ano naman effect of the new debtor's insolvency or non-fulfillment of obligation sa delegasyon? Delegasyon naman ang pag-uusapan natin, ha? Okay, remember, ang expromission, when a third person of his own initiative and without the knowledge or against the will of the original debtor assumes the being a debtor. In delegation, it takes place when the creditor accept a third person. Okay? Yung isa accept, yung isa same, own initiative. Next topic, effect of new debtors' insolvency or non-fulfillment of the obligation in delegation. Okay? In delegation. It must be noted that the article speaks only of insolvency. If the non-fulfillment of the obligation is due to the other causes, the old debtor is not liable. The general rule is that the old debtor is not liable to the creditor in case of insolvency of the new debtor. Remember, class, insolvency is declared only by law. Okay? By law. The exceptions are the said insolvency was already existing and public knowledge, although it was known to the old debtor at the time of the delegation. The insolvency was already existing. Ito yung mga exceptions, ha? The insolvency was already existing and known to the debtor, although it was not public knowledge. But at the time of the delegation, pwede. Okay? What happened? What is the effect of novation on accessory obligation? Of course, it provides that an exception in the case of an accessory obligation created in a favor of the third person, which remains in force unless said third person gives consent to novation. This is so because a person should not be prejudiced by the act of another without its consent. Dahil lang naman, when the principal obligation is extinguished in consequence of an innovation, accessory obligation may subsist only insofar as they may benefit third person who did not give their consent. Okay? Bigyan tayo ng magandang example. A owes B 2,000 with interest at 14%. B owes C 280 pesos. It was agreed upon among the parties that A would pay the interest of 280 to C. In this case, besides the principal obligation of A, there is a stipulation in favor of C, a third person. Later on, A and B executed another contract whereby they agreed that A would deliver to B a television set in payment of the loan. In spite of the novation, the accessory obligation to pay the interest of 280 to C still subsists unless C give his consent to novation. What will be the effect where the new obligation is void? Okay? According to Article 1297, this stresses one of the essential requirements of a novation. To wit, the new obligation must be valid, dapat valid. The general rule is that there is no novation if the new obligation is void. Siyempre, pag hindi effective or void yung bago, hindi mag-i-effect ang novation. General rule is that there is no novation if the new obligation is void. Therefore, the original one shall subsist for the reason that the second obligation being inexistent, it cannot extinguish or modify the first. Okay? Effect where the new obligation is voidable. If the new obligation is only voidable, novation can take place. Sinasabi naman natin kanina, void na eh. Pero pag voidable lang, pwede namang mag-take place. Because but, tandaan nyo, ang voidable, pwedeng i-annul yan. Annulled until it's declared, it is annulled. It is valid until annulled, sorry. Remember, valid ang voidable until annulled. The novation must be considered as not having taken place. The original one can be enforced unless the intention of the parties otherwise. So, valid siya. So, pag na-annul siya, na-declare, we will revert back to the original contract. Effect where the old obligation is void or voidable. The void obligation cannot be novated because there is nothing to novate. Diba? Void na eh. Yung old obligation, ba't magkakaroon ka ng bagong kontrata? Diba? There is nothing to novate. However, if the original obligation is only voidable, or if voidable obligation is validated by ratification, the novation is valid. Pero pag na-annul, ay wala. Sorry. Walang dapat innovate. Okay? Or paltan. Example, S agreed to deliver prohibited drugs to B. Later on, it was agreed that S would pay B 100,000 instead of delivering the drugs. Diba? Merong first contract and first agreement, may second agreement. The novation is void because the original obligation is void because void naman ang drugs, 'di ba? Now, let's go to subrogation. Subrogation naman tayo. Ano ba ibig sabihin ng subrogation? When we speak of subrogation, it is the substitution of one person in the place of a creditor. Subrogi and subroger. Okay? Subrogation is the substitution of one person in the place of a creditor. So, papatan mo yung creditor. Sub. That is subrogation. With reference to a lawful claim or right, giving the former all the rights of the latter. Pag nasub mo lahat ng karapatan ng creditor, pinasa mo na doon sa subrogi. Okay? Subrogi. Creditor, subroger. Okay? Including the right to employ all remedies to enforce payment. So, kasama doon lahat ng remedyo, lahat ng remedies para ma-enforce ang payment. There are two kinds of conventional of subrogation. Number one, conventional. When it takes place by express agreement of original parties. Trip ng mga bagong parties. So, that is conventional. Legal when it takes place without agreement but by operation of law. Ganun lang yun. Conventional subrogation must be clearly established in order to that it may take place. Legal subrogation is not presumed except in cases expressly provided by law. Expressly provided by law. Whew. Ano pa? What are the cases of legal subrogation and effect? Meron ba tayong cases of legal subrogation? Meron. Number one, when a creditor pays another creditor who is preferred. That is a legal subrogation. Number two, when a third person without interest in the obligation pays with the approval of the debtor. And number three, when a third person with interest in the obligation pays even without the knowledge of the debtor. Bigyan ko na lang kayo ng example. Number one, cases. Ito yung mga example ng legal subrogation. When a creditor pays another creditor who is preferred. A owes B 10,000, secured by a first mortgage on the land of A. A also owes C 20,000. This debt is unsecured. So under the law, B, who is a preferred creditor, has preference to payment with respect to the land as against C, who is merely an ordinary creditor. If C pays the debt of A to B, C will be subrogated in B's right so that he can have the mortgage foreclosed in case A fails to pay the 10,000 debt. Intindihan nyo? Okay, ulitin ko ha. Si A may utang kay B ng 10,000, pero yung utang na yon, secure yon by B having a mortgage. Okay? Si A may utang din kay C. Okay? Pero itong utang niya kay C, walang papel. Tentuhan lang. So, dito, si B ang preferred creditor kasi meron siyang mortgage. Okay? Si C naman, it's just an ordinary creditor, pautang lang. Pero yung isa kasi, may nakasanla. So, paano ngayon, kung binayaran ni C yung utang kay A, yung utang ni A kay B, binayaran ni C yung utang ni A kay B. So, what will happen? So, si C, ngayon will be subrogated in the right of B, yung mga karapatan ni B as a secured, as a preferred creditor. Okay? So that will happen. Yun yung mangyayari. Number two, that is going to happen. Okay? Next, when a third person without interest in the obligation pays with the approval of the debtor. Example, A owes B 10,000. C pays B with the express or implied consent of A. In this case, C will be subrogated in the rights of B. Simple lang yun kasi may approval yun. So, mangyayari, lahat ng karapatan ni B, mapupunta na kay A. When a third person with interest in the obligation pays even without the knowledge of debtor. Okay? So, same example, A owes B 10,000, C pays B with the express or implied consent of A. So, anong mangyayari? C is the guarantor of A. C is a person interested in the fulfillment of obligation of A as he would benefit by the extinguished. If C pays B even without the knowledge of A, C is subrogated in the rights of B. Because confusion takes place in the person of C, hence the guarantee is extinguished but the principal obligation still subsists and si C na ngayon ang magiging creditor. So what is the effect of legal subrogation? The effect of legal subrogation is to transfer to the new creditor the credit and all the rights and actions so that could have been exercised by the former creditor, either against the debtor or against third persons, be they guarantors or mortgagors. Simply stated, except only for the change in the person of the creditor, the obligation subsists in all respects as before the novation. Okay? O ano naman effect ng partial subrogation? The creditor to whom partial payment has been made by the new creditor remains a creditor to the extent of the balance of debt. In case of insolvency of the debtor, he is given a preferential right under the article of the Civil Code to recover the remainder as against the new creditor. Okay? So, yun lang naman ang effect ng partial subrogation. Okay. Class, study your lesson. Stay safe. God bless. End of our topic. Our next topic will be contract.